Right, so here we are again. Another ceasefire is being rigged to collapse with an added dose of desperation to seize the narrative back for Israel as the real victims we should all feel sorry for, as if 2 years of genocide can so easily be scrubbed from our minds. Washington and Tel Aviv are now saying they have credible evidence that Hamas is plotting to end the ceasefire, to attack its own people even though it's their drones that have never left the sky and it's Palestinians who are still dying at Israel's hands, having never actually ceased the firing bit themselves. You could almost admire the attempt at choreography here if it weren't still soaked in so much blood. The US State Department posts a warning about an allegedly impending Hamas attack. Israel calls that proof, but their bombs have never stopped falling, and they're still arming gangs within the Strip to destabilise it. It's a blame game so polished it could have been scripted, because it no doubt was. What we're watching isn't a truce, it's a performance. The genocide still hasn't stopped. It's just going through some script changes. Israel wants its victim status back, but that cat has long ago got out of the bag, and no matter what they do, they're never getting it back. If this ceasefire is getting derailed, we know who's behind it. The same people behind every other collapsed ceasefire. Right, so when this latest apparent Gaza ceasefire took effect on the 10th of October, diplomats sold it as a turning point, didn't they? This time, it was all going to be different. After 2 years of aerial bombardment, starvation and mass displacement, the mediators from Egypt and Qatar and the United States all announced what they called a comprehensive cessation of hostilities. The text required Israel to end military operations, to free the captives, to open the Rafah crossing, all things we'd all wanted to see for so many months, and then permit unrestricted humanitarian aid as well. For Gaza's 2 million residents, it was meant to mean survival. 8 days on, the figures tell a different story, though. Gaza's government media office confirmed 47 documented Israeli violations, 38 Palestinians killed, 143 wounded, attacks recorded in every single governorate. Civil defence teams documented 129 individual attacks since this truce began. In Shujaiya, 5 civilians died inspecting the ruins of their homes. In Al-Fakari, east of Khan Yunis, another was killed by a drone. The deadliest incident came in Gaza City's Zaytun neighbourhood when an Israeli tank shell destroyed a car carrying the Abu Shaban family. 11 people killed, 7 of them children. Gaza Civil Defence said the family had tried to cross the yellow line, this invisible boundary the Israeli army now uses to designate where civilians may move. There are no physical markers, they're only just now starting to pop up, these bright yellow cubes of concrete. But there were no warning signs where this incident took place, only risk of death for guessing wrong, it seems. Every one of these actions breaches the ceasefire, yet Western governments continue to call the truce fragile, implying there's some kind of asymmetry between the occupier and the occupied here, when we know that isn't the case. While Israel broke the agreement in plain sight, Washington decided to shift the narrative, though. The US State Department had posted on X that it had informed guarantor nations of credible reports now indicating an imminent ceasefire violation by Hamas against the people of Gaza, against their own people. Well, when did they start doing that then? This statement warned that such a move would constitute a direct and grave violation of the ceasefire agreement. Here we go, we're thinking. Promising that measures will be taken to protect the people of Gaza. Well, when have you ever put them before Israel up until now? No evidence, of course, accompanying this claim. Hamas immediately rejected the accusation as false and aligned with the Israeli occupation's misleading propaganda, something we have mountains of evidence of them having done previously. They have accused Washington of providing political cover for continued Israeli crimes, including the arming of gangs operating inside Gaza, with several, including the Abu Shabaab gang, being directly connected to ISIS. Hamas pointed out that these militias, which are responsible for kidnappings and robberies and assaults on aid convoys, had been organised and supplied by Israel itself. The group urged the United States to stop echoing Israel's narrative and instead just enforce the truce that both sides had agreed to. So the timeline now exposes a great deal of intent. Israel's bombardment of Gaza has continued. We knew it would, really, didn't we? We had no doubt they would breach it, and they've done it with every ceasefire that's ever been accepted by Benjamin Netanyahu. And we can look at other nations where that is happening now as well. The United States accused Hamas of plotting to resume fighting, echoing Israeli narratives based on apparent evidence they, as per usual, don't show us. So the accusation was not an intelligence finding, it's just the groundwork being laid for the next justification to breach the ceasefire and try desperately to change the narrative as to who is actually at fault to give Israel their victim status back. By declaring that a Hamas violation was imminent, Washington ensured that any subsequent Israeli strike could be presented as preemptive evidence, thinking we would just forget the last 2 years of Israeli conduct, and indeed Israeli conduct during the last 8 days of this supposed ceasefire as well. Footage that has actually been verified by Sky News, which has been reported as well, a mainstream media source reporting this, so read into that what you will at this point. Earlier this month showed how this narrative was constructed, though. The video captured a night convoy of pickup trucks leaving an Israeli military post near the Eretz crossing in the north of Gaza and entering militia-held territory there. The trucks carried food and water and fuel canisters, all marked with Israeli supplier logos, and they delivered supplies to a faction calling itself the People's Army, led by a guy called Ashraf al-Mansi, a commander who later appeared on video footage threatening Hamas and claiming control of local security zones. Israeli outlets confirmed that al-Mansi's group was one of 4 armed factions now active in Gaza, all within areas still monitored by the Israeli army, Israeli-aligned groups opposed to Hamas. Channel 12 later reported that Hamas had captured 45 pickup trucks, hundreds of rifles, and large stocks of ammunition originally supplied to those militias by Israeli units. Thus, they're rearming Hamas in effect as they deal with Israel's minions within Gaza, responsible for so much of the food aid thefts over the past several months that Hamas have been accused of. All arms being delivered into Gaza, Israel could use as a pretext for saying they need to disarm Hamas by force, pointing to them rearming rather than disarming, even though Israel put those weapons in the territory. Inside Gaza, the Interior Ministry has begun an amnesty program inviting gang members and collaborators to surrender, and several have apparently accepted that. The US State Department described this domestic policing effort as proof that Hamas was preparing for internal purges, so there's a distortion, isn't it? A distortion that turned law enforcement measures into an alleged war plan now. So this cycle is deliberate and not particularly difficult to pull apart. It's pretty desperate as well. Create disorder, then use it to prove the target's ungovernability. The ceasefire, of course, required Hamas to release 20 live captives and return some 28 deceased captives within a 72-hour window. That was the original agreement. Hamas released every living hostage, and they've done that. The difficulty has been the dead ones, though. Many had been killed by Israeli airstrikes and remain buried under collapsed buildings, and we've seen evidence of this. 2 senior advisors to Donald Trump have confirmed that Hamas has honoured the live hostage clause, but that the recovery of bodies could only start once Israeli bombing stopped, which of course they've never done. Israel nevertheless held the heavy machinery as well, required to excavate the rubble. But then, of course, they just accused Hamas of violating the deal for not producing the bodies. Netanyahu's office warned that if the remains were not returned, Israel would impose further sanctions and reconsider its withdrawal lines, having already decided to keep the Rafah crossing shut in violation of the truce in and of itself, not to mention a war crime as that is, linking aid to the release of remains. We're not talking about Israel breaking the truce, though, are we? Again, it's all being focused on Hamas once more. And again, this con is easy to cut through. A logistical impossibility has been produced, deliberately created by Israeli bombardment, that is itself a break in the truce, all becoming political leverage to prolong it or end the ceasefire, and then blaming Hamas. We can see what you're doing here. But at the same time, Israel began returning the Palestinian bodies it had retained throughout the war as well. Over 3 days, the army has transferred 120 corpses to Gaza through the International Committee of the Red Cross. Medical staff have documented rope marks around necks, bound wrists and ankles, blindfolds, close-range gunshots, and crushed limbs consistent with being run over by tanks. Dr. Abdullah al-Borsh, Gaza's Director General of Hospitals, called the findings clear evidence of execution. And Euromed Monitor Chairman Rami Abdu said the bodies had been kept at freezing temperatures. Some appeared exhumed, and one still had an IV line attached to it, suggesting death during some sort of treatment. The government media office has also now formally accused Israel of stealing organs from the dead, given that many of the 120 bodies returned were apparently missing corneas, livers, and limbs, and demanded an international inquiry into torture, mutilation, and organ theft. That's getting rather played down in Western media. The pattern of torture and execution is therefore now documented, and has actually been over the last several days. Civil defence engineers estimate that roughly 10,000 people remain under rubble. So with current tools, they say recovery could take 10 years. Israel want Hamas to do this in 72 hours and recover all of their hostages' remains. But 10 years is what the engineers are saying it's going to take with the current equipment. Why won't Israel give them the current equipment? They're intentionally withholding it all the stuff they need to recover the bodies of deceased Israeli hostages and repatriate the remains. Well, why are they doing that, I wonder? Well, as it happens, the necessary cranes and excavators are all parked on the Egyptian side of Rafah, waiting for permission that never comes. The crossing, deliberately kept shut by Netanyahu, isn't just shutting out aid, it's shutting out the means to shift the rubble too. By refusing that permission, and no one ever questions that, Israel is ensuring Hamas cannot meet its obligations and then cite this failure as proof of deceit. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, deliberate obstruction of humanitarian rescue constitutes a war crime, so just chalk another charge up to Israel's ever-growing crime sheet. The humanitarian picture remains catastrophic. The World Food Programme reports moving about 560 tonnes of food per day since the 10th of October, which is great, but it's half the minimum requirement needed for survival right now. Spokesperson Abir Atifa said the ceasefire opened a narrow window of opportunity, but stressed that access still depends entirely on Israeli approval. One side getting to dictate the terms. UNICEF Senior Emergency Coordinator in Gaza, Hamish Young, called the conditions catastrophic and listed shortages of food, shortages of tents, of plastic sheeting, of fuel, of spare parts for desalination plants. The list goes on. Each truckload of aid now passes through a maze of Israeli checkpoints constantly being held up. Quantities fluctuate daily as a result. Electricity remains intermittent. Hospitals are still having to ration anaesthetics and oxygen. The humanitarian pipeline has become a lever of control again. Enough aid to prevent collapse, enough to preserve the facade of meeting the terms of the ceasefire when much of the media will cast a blind eye over the actual detail, but never enough to allow meaningful recovery. Gaza's survival is still being stage managed at the discretion of the same army responsible for its destruction. So while aid trickles in, Israel has begun to physically redraw Gaza's map, though. Israel Hayom revealed plans for a new boundary, this yellow line, to divide the strip into controlled and uncontrolled zones. And as I mentioned earlier, there are these yellow painted concrete cubes now apparently marking the perimeter. Crossing that line invites live fire. The line encloses more than half of Gaza, though, preventing displaced residents from returning to their homes. Inside the permitted zone, Israel intends to authorise limited reconstruction under supervision of friendly militias. Oh, they're friendly now, are they? In Rafah, a prototype district is being built by the aforementioned Abu Shabaab gang, with its documented links to ISIS-aligned networks. A school and a mosque apparently stand ready for visiting cameras. The area is being marketed as a model community, a media showcase of what a re-educated Gaza might look like from their perspective. Never mind letting the people of Gaza actually decide these things for themselves. Outside of that, the 2 million people, the people of Gaza, of course remain barred from re-entry, though. The bright yellow cubes have become the truce's defining visual symbol, therefore, a ceasefire mapped in concrete, dividing the living from the excluded. In parallel, Israeli outlet N12 reported that Trump's corpse-like son-in-law Jared Kushner, Palantir's Peter Thiel, and fellow tech billionaire Larry Ellison plan to turn parts of Gaza into a tax-free innovation hub. Well, who granted you access to the land for that, then? Yeah. Well, their project envisions cloud computing centres and light manufacturing plants using low-cost labour and simple regulations to facilitate business with Saudi Arabia, talking up the recent hopes that Netanyahu has had to get that normalisation with Saudi Arabia through. So much as he's pinning on that, he's actually brought forward Israeli elections next year by several months. But the concept matches the Yellow Line's geography, a fenced enclave marketed as modernisation. The combination of military boundary and private capital investment redefines occupation as development. But development for who? Not the people of Gaza. It absolutely isn't going to be is Palestine for the Palestinian people. This is how post-war control gets built, though, isn't it? Not through annexation, but through ownership. Gaza's reconstruction is being packaged as an opportunity market for foreign investors, while its population remains locked outside the designated growth zones, but no doubt ready to provide that low-cost labour as needed. Inside Israel, domestic politics mirrors the same inversion. Families of former hostages who once demanded an end to the war, who once attacked Netanyahu as prolonging it for his own ends, are now urging Netanyahu to abandon the ceasefire until all the bodies are returned. They berated him incessantly whilst living hostages remained in the strip. Now they demand more warfare from him instead. It says an awful lot of Israeli society. Their new position aligns precisely with the government's refusal to reopen Rafah, converting public grief into policy justification, but only ever in the interests of one side. Israel's detention system also continues unchecked. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, was seized from his workplace last year and has been held without charge ever since. Where there was hope not long ago that he would soon be released, instead, his administrative detention has been extended by 6 months, all still without charge. Another detainee, 28-year-old Mahmoud Abu Ful, has upon his release told Al Jazeera that torture in Israeli prisons has left him blind, that he's delighted to be free, delighted to hear his mother's voice once again, but will never again see her face. The relationship between Israel and its guarantor remains symbiotic as well. Israel acts, Washington reframes, all with the mainstream media dutifully repeating the desired narratives. Netanyahu closes Rafah, and instead of being slammed as another abuse of humanitarian law, instead of being slammed as a breach of the truce, of the ceasefire agreement, it gets justified instead, unjustifiable as it absolutely is. The Israeli army supplies militias. Officials refer to them as local partners, all despite their known links in many cases to organised terror elsewhere in the world. Every single diplomatic euphemism converts a violation into a procedural detail and just expects all of us to accept it unquestioningly. But we must always question everything, because it doesn't take much digging to show it all up as a total sham. Numbers remain the most objective measure of the deceit, though it seems a shame to reduce lives harmed and lives ended to mere numbers. 47 ceasefire violations, 129 attacks, 38 killed, 143 injured, 135 bodies returned showing torture, 10,000 still buried, 560 tons of food entering daily, less than half the actual need. Each and every figure is sourced to official or humanitarian documentation. Each is a claim that is for the most part buried by mainstream sources. Together they describe not peace, but a managed continuation of the genocide. Mediators might claim progress. The stronger power uses the pause, though, to reposition itself. In Gaza, the US plays both roles, peace broker and belligerent, which is just a farce. Its advance warning about Hamas allegedly planning a breach functioning as a trailer before you watch the full movie play out, in their minds, already seeding in your mind what you expect to see. But the Gaza cut of said movie, if you will, plays out like a completely different production. Every single mechanism of the truce, the aid, the hostage exchanges, the border reopening, remains under Israeli veto. This arrangement cannot survive because it was designed not to. It clearly can't when one side has all the say and the other side is expected to just suck it up, and yet the media still blame them for any breaches of it. Failure is the point here. Blame is the strategy. Netanyahu needs all of this to stay in power, and Israel needs its victim status back, and this is the latest attempt for them to try and get it. It must fail, surely. We've seen enough to never let Israel get that claim back ever again, though. The language of officialdom now describes cruelty as stability. Israeli armed gangs as security partners. Hamas's policing of those gangs, despite Trump assenting to Hamas dealing with them personally, is now contradicted by Israel. Tortured prisoners are detainees, bodies returned with hands bound or remains transferred, the US phrase protecting the people of Gaza. It all accompanies policies that continue to keep them under siege, though. International bodies issue statements of concern without consequence. The law that once constrained occupation has been replaced by permission through silence. And yet, Gaza's civic life endures. There is amongst all of this some good news, actually, and it's the best way to end a video like this on whenever you can find such news. You see, just yesterday, UNRWA reopened schools for roughly 300,000 students. 8,000 teachers returned to work. About 10,000 pupils now attend classes in person. The rest study remotely from shelters. It's good news. But what the kids have lost already bears thinking about. UNRWA's Adnan Abu Hasna said simply, it's impossible to have 2 years without schooling, preceded by 2 years of corona. Education continues intense nonetheless, though, in damaged classrooms and bombed courtyards. It's both necessity and defiance. It's proof of that governance persisting without Israeli permission. The pattern visible in Gaza repeats the model of earlier interventions of military partition followed by privatised reconstruction. Iraq had its green zone. Gaza has its yellow line now and proposed start-up city, but they follow the same template. Control is exerted through possession of territory, through contracts and dependency rather than any sign of direct annexation. The language of peace and opportunity conceals the mechanics of enclosure. What's being built is not coexistence but containment. The political utility of this system relies on a colonial reflex. The oppressed must be portrayed as the authors of their own suffering so that Israel can justify keeping them under occupation. But that must end as well. Hence every round of violence ending with new accusations that Hamas has sabotage peace, because that's the narrative Israel needs. The US warned of a Hamas plot. It's all part of that tradition, the myth of the ungovernable native reborn for the news cycle. It allows the West to maintain moral distance while funding the occupation. The narrative does not describe events, it preserves hierarchy. The evidence assembled by Gaza's institutions, humanitarian agencies, and independent journalists establishes a consistent pattern of deliberate violation, executions, torture, and obstruction of aid, all set against Israeli and US claims where there's no evidence at all. Each and every example that Gaza has gathered is a prosecutable war crime under the Geneva Conventions. Complaints against Israeli officials were already before the International Criminal Court, who have just thrown out an attempt by Netanyahu to try and get his arrest warrant overturned, along with that of former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. Political shields, vetoes, diplomatic pressure and selective reporting, they all delay, but they can't erase the record. And they can't wipe it from our minds either, no matter how much propaganda they try and shovel at us. Documentation is itself a form of resistance, and it's all being documented. Every autopsy report, every verified video, every retrieved body undermines the fiction of compliance on Israel's behalf. In Gaza, ceasefire has come to mean the management of violence rather than its end. The bombs fall less frequently, but they're still falling. Yet starvation and detention and territorial division also continue. The US-Israeli accusation that Hamas is preparing to violate the truce is not a misunderstanding. It's a device that sustains this system. The lie precedes the act, then excuses it afterwards. It's the perfect circle of impunity. Without seeing the evidence, without providing any, there's no reason to believe their version of events, when they have collapsed every ceasefire prior to this one. That is documented. On the same day the US issued its warning, 300,000 children returned to class, though. They sat under tarpaulins, yes. They wrote on scavenged paper, yes. They tried to remember some semblance of normality for a short while. That small fact carries more meaning than any diplomatic communique can. It shows Gaza still governs itself, still educates its next generation, still refuses erasure, just as they've managed to do for the last 77 years. Israel and the Trump-aligned State Department have spent the ceasefire constructing a story in which Hamas becomes the villain of a peace Israel never intended to keep. But the evidence on the ground from the attacks, the bodies, the yellow cubes dividing the strip, the official ex-post predicting crimes that have not occurred, now all tells its own story. The ceasefire narrative was scripted in advance by the very governments claiming to defend it, and that truth, now documented beyond denial, is what will ultimately survive them. For more on the ceasefire abuses Israel has been documented to have been committing, the very reasons we cannot allow them to regain control of the narrative, do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.